Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima Majur of economicsjunkie.com. We are here to tackle ideas both ancient and modern in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. And this is going to be episode number 32, which is real environmentalism. So, first caveat is that Nima will not be joining us today. He had some business in England, I guess specifically Liverpool, and we're crossing our fingers hoping he doesn't get knifed to death or acid splashed in his face in the wonderful land known as Englandistan, which, by banning knives has, completely reduced knife attacks to nothing, which is, common when we ban things. So while he's out there, doing his best to survive a crusade or a jihad, whatever side he happens to be on. I guess he could pick both sides. Considering his background, we'll see which one he ends up picking. But he'll be back with us next week. And while he was gone, I wanted to chat a little bit about environmentalism again, because we've discussed, me and Nima, environmentalism a few times on this podcast. And normally it is largely accompanied by Nima going on bloodshot, vein popping out of his neck rants about the horrible, nasty death cult known as environmentalism, and that only inept retards could be stupid enough to follow such a thing. And I've gotten some feedback from a few people saying that, the stuff that you talk about is bad, and we should be concerned about what these people are saying about environmentalism, but there's still good things. We want to take care of the environment. And I realized that we were so busy making fun of Al Gore and talking about how stupid Greenpeace is that we forgot to mention that we actually like the environment, and there's nothing wrong with taking care of the environment. In fact, of course, everybody wants a great place to live. We love lush nature. We like clean air. We like clean water. Salmon are great. Predators have their place in the ecosystem, and all these sorts of things. And I just wanted to take some time to talk about, first of all, the way the language gets corrupted for when you take a word like environmentalism, and what may be some things that are real environmental problems that, typically, quote unquote, environmentalists tend to overlook because they're too busy frantically exhaling CO2 in order to scream about how dangerous CO2 is. So, first of all, it's a word like environmentalism has gotten an unfortunate rap because it is turned into an entirely political term. You look at the word and I mean, this is happening more and more as we enter the late stages of the 1984 playbook, where we're really starting to see newspeak come into existence, where the words are literally being redefined under our noses, and a new language is getting created where the words that we because the meanings that we think they have, because we look at a word like environmentalism and we say, okay, it has environment right in there, so we should be talking about the environment, right? Well, environmentalism has come to mean deindustrialization. CO2 is the enemy. People are bad and they need to die, as a political movement. Now, what sucks is, first of all, the obfuscation of this political movement hidden in this word. But if you actually want to talk about environmental problems, what word are you supposed to use? Like, if I don't want a bunch of sewage in my backyard, I'm like, this is an environmental problem. And everyone's like, well, I don't see the CO2 issue here. So when I've got a few things to talk about, and I'm by no means an expert on this sort of stuff, and these are just some of the things that I've noticed in my own research and professional career. I'll talk a little bit about my time at the oil refinery. I used to be a laboratory technician at an oil refinery. And comparing that to what is really a non-problem, which is the CO2 thing. So let's start talking about oil. Now, I was, at the time, I worked at the oil refinery between the ages of 20 and 22, if I remember correctly. And at the time, I was actually quite anti-oil. I got a job because I needed a job, and I had a chemistry degree. And I'm like, well, I got to do something, right? Got to eat and pay rent and stuff. Work all summer so I can pay for 1/4 of college tuition in fall. And I was quite anti-oil while I was there, and I had a very, how should I call it, sardonic view of what I was doing. And, it also really didn't help. I had a much more leftist viewpoint at this time. It also really didn't help that the most stereotypical, over-bureaucratized concept of a corporation that you can imagine was like exactly what was going on there, and it was mixed with like the most stereotypical unionization or bureaucratization from unions that you could imagine was happening at the same time. So like there was this 90% of our day was in between sitting and doing nothing and dealing with all this bureaucracy that was a result of both the corporate side and the union side. So I really had a hard time while I was working there, but I did find the oil process fascinating. And I learned a lot of things about oil and gasoline and diesel and propane and all this sorts of stuff. And, one of the things that we're told that oil is so horrible is because, first of all, it's toxic. In and of itself, it's toxic. Second of all, you burn it and it creates CO2. It actually creates quite other few real toxins that I'll bring up here in a second. But of course, the big focus is, oh my God, the CO2. The first thing with oil, and I want to tell a story because we used to get crude oil samples that I had to test at the refinery, and it was the first time I'd ever seen actual crude oil up close, and we get these samples in these glass quart jars, and with the sample that we got, we would use like 3 syringefuls, and then we'd have to pour the rest out down the sink. And it's not as bad as it sounds because we were on an internal water system and the sink went to a water treatment unit, so we were allowed to pour hydrocarbons down the sink, and it wasn't that big of a deal. I remember I put a glove on, and nitrile glove, and as I was pouring it out, I'd pour it over my glove just to see like the black tarry oil for the first time and see the fumes come off of it and see, because there's everything from methane to like deep nasty asphalt tar all mixed together, and it's really quite fascinating stuff. And at some point I realized every time I did it, my hands started feeling a little bit weird. And that's when I later learned that those gloves are actually splash gloves. And there are some things inside the oil, namely naphthenes and aromatics like benzene or toluene or xylene, which can go through the gloves quite easily, and I stopped at some point. But that brings up the point I wanted to say is there are, in terms of human proximity to this stuff, there are a lot of nasty chemicals in crude oil. And benzene, I think, is the one. I don't know if it's the most toxic, but it definitely gets the biggest toxic rap, because at the oil refinery, everything that we had that had anything to do with the crude oil or the gasoline had danger, contains benzene, cancer hazard stickers slapped all over it, and we needed all these different types of benzene personal protective equipment. But what's interesting, despite the fact that this stuff is so toxic, I mean, at least to humans, or contains at least these things that are super duper toxic to humans, is that don't forget that oil is actually a natural product. It's not synthesized. We pulled it out of the ground, and oil has been naturally leaking out of the ground for who knows how long. And nature has actually figured out how to deal with oil. I've heard about this for like the Valdez, Exxon Valdez oil spill. Is the places that they clean up are actually in worse condition today than the places that they left alone, because the chemicals that they spray are nastier than the oil itself. So it's we got to be careful with stuff that's toxic, because obviously in the process of nature cleaning it up, I'm sure a lot of nature had to die in order for that to happen. But to see oil as like this end all thing that's going to choke the earth out and just kill it, it's just not accurate. Now, the things that we can make from oil, that might be a little bit of a different story. And when one of the things I wanted to mention was, because I said there are some toxic things that come out of oil, particularly when we're, say, burning gasoline or burning diesel, or not so much propane. Propane's pretty darn clean, but there's a lot of heavy metals in oil, particularly, if I remember correctly, vanadium, sodium, and there's a third one. I can't remember. I used to have to test for them, but vanadium was one of the big ones. High levels of vanadium naturally occurring in oil, and I don't think anyone really knows why. Is that when you're driving a car, the thing not to worry about is the CO2 coming out. The thing to worry about is the heavy metals coming out. And I've even remember listening to Dave Asprey, the guy who came up with Bulletproof and Bulletproof Coffee and stuff. He's brought this up, and he's had people on his podcast bring this up, that people who live closer to busy roads will actually show signs of, I forgot what sort of sickness specifically that they were talking about on the particular podcast I was listening to, but there's an issue living closer to more busy roads because of the heavy metals from the cars. And I think that you could say the same thing about any plants or, farm food that's being grown close to busy roads. They're going to pick up all these heavy metals from the cars and uncombusted fuel. So, CO2 is not the big deal. Carbon monoxide is but a little bit more of a big deal. I don't know if it's as big of a deal as like, oh my God, we're driving all these cars and it's releasing all this carbon monoxide into the air, because carbon monoxide is actually quite reactive. It's fuel. You can burn it. In fact, it's apparently such an efficient fuel that after, I believe it was World War II, Germans actually developed vehicles that ran off of burning wood, and that wood would create a bunch of carbon monoxide, and the car would run off of that, burning that carbon monoxide generated from the incomplete combustion of burning the wood. So, however, carbon monoxide, because it's reactive, it reacts with the hemoglobin in your blood, which pushes out and it gets stuck in the hemoglobin in your blood, which prevents an oxygen from getting attached to your hemoglobin, which prevents your body from oxygenating itself. That's why you suffocate if you breathe in carbon monoxide. Which, that's bad, but I think in general, if carbon monoxide gets released into the atmosphere because it's so reactive, at some point it's going to turn into carbon dioxide, and even that's not that big of a deal as long as you're not in close proximity to it. And one more thing I wanted to say on oil was regulation. Oh, my favorite, this is a libertarian network. Regulation are favorite things. So when I was working at the laboratory, we had to test for everything. I mean, particularly the final products we made at the refinery I worked at: gasoline, propane, diesel, and what's called bunker oil. I'll talk about that in a second. And particularly with the diesel, the propane, and the gasoline, we really had to make sure, specifically the sulfur, that the sulfur level was super duper 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 low. Now, part of this, the reason that sulfur has to be super low is because it poisons the catalyst in catalytic converters that are needed to convert, say, carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide before it spits out of your exhaust pipe. But, the other big thing is that, sulfur is supposed to be this big, nasty environmental toxin once you combust it, because it can create all sorts of sulfur dioxide and sulfuric acid and all this sort of stuff, which is, the thing where you get acid rain from, that and nitric acid. So whether I don't know what it's at now, but at the time it was like 10 parts per million or 15 parts per million that the sulfur had to be at. However, the bunker oil, which is kind of the low, nasty tar that gets spit out of the refinery, that's burnt on the like big tanker ships, like the ships that were delivering crude oil to us, ran on this massive, nasty bunker oil. And the sulfur content, I remember testing it, it would be between 2 and 3%. Now, there's 1,000 parts per million per percent. So 2 or 3% is actually 2 or 3,000 parts per million. So I always just found it to be an absolute crack up that we were agonizing ourselves so hard over, oh my god, the gasoline and the diesel has to be below 10 parts per million or whatever on in order to pass the regulation. And when it comes to the ocean and the bunker oil and the big tankers out there using it for fuel to drive or to not sail, but you guys get my point, move. Oh yeah, just burn all that sulfur out in the ocean. Who cares? I guess the regulations don't count out there. So, yeah, hooray, oil. Or hooray, bunker fuel. So, when it comes to oil, I think that the speed at which we have progressed technologically, if certain technologies hadn't been suppressed and continue to be suppressed, I think we would have evolved beyond oil by now. However, the state that we're in now, where we are so dependent on it, that the human race is dependent on this oil to survive, because we need the hydrocarbons to grow food and transport food. And the only reason why we've been able to have such an explosion in population since the Industrial Revolution is because we were able to figure out how to release the chemical energy, first from coal and then second from oil. So me and Eva discussed this, and it's trying to get to the real environmentalist problems, is we need this to survive. And to say, okay, let's just stop using oil because it's killing the planet, means you're just going to kill all the people on the planet. And if you think that that's going to magically make the planet great and not descend it into poverty and war and nastiness, I don't know what to tell you. So after oil, I wanted to talk a little bit about uranium. So as a chemistry major, we were taught the terrifying nature of uranium, specifically because it has a half-life of 4.5 billion years and is very, very, very radioactive and will give you radiation poisoning and cause cancer and do all of these sorts of nasty things to you. And when I remember taking that into account and learning, first of all, about nuclear reactors, where they have the potential to have meltdown, and then you take the spent fuel and you got to bury it in the earth because you don't know what to do with it, and it's got to stay there for 4.5 billion years times however many half-lives you need before it finally decays away, which is longer than the Earth is going to be around by the time that the sun supernovas. And the stuff that they don't put in the earth, they sell to the military, and they make bullets out of it, and they go up and they shoot up the Middle East or wherever else, or Kosovo or whatever other country. And they make the places radioactive wastelands to the point that if you want to see some of the most terrifying shit you've ever seen in your life, go look up the deformed babies that have been being born in Iraq since the U.S. went in there. Because everyone's suffering from radiation poisoning because so much depleted uranium has been shot around Iraq. I mean, it's just so horrifying. It's hard to contemplate. So for the longest time, I was actually quite anti-nuclear because I saw it as something either potentially very, very horribly negative to the environment. I mean, just look at Fukushima. I mean, I know we've stopped talking about it, but isn't it consistently just barfing more and more radioactive water into the oceans just over and over and over again, and no one could even get close to it? I don't even know what the latest update on that one was. And like I said, the same thing over in Iraq, where we're just shooting up a bunch of bullets and destroying genetic lines. I mean, we've talked about genocide in history. Isn't that some form of genocide? It's kind of more like genocidal torture, where you don't just like kill everybody. You let the DNA get so deformed that it's unable to reproduce with itself. But I've read this, and I don't know if it's true. And I'd like someone to provide a little bit more information for me. Is that uranium and MOX, mixed oxide fuel rods, can actually be recycled, and that every single byproduct from the uranium reactions, fission reactions, because when the atom splits, it splits into cesium and iodine, I think, are the first two things, if I remember correctly. And then those things split, and then those things split. And you get all these sorts of nasty radioactive elements. Well, apparently, every single one of those elements have some sort of either medical or industrial use somewhere else, and can actually be, instead of, having to bury them in the ground and say, oh my God, what do we do with these toxins? These are actually valuable resources. And the depleted uranium itself, it can be extracted and then recycled into the new mixed oxide fuel rods. So I thought this was a very interesting way to look at nuclear energy, because obviously nuclear energy is a great way, if we overlook the environmental issues, potential environmental issues, it's a great way to create energy. So if there's a way to recycle these fuel rods, you got to kind of scratch your head and say, well, why don't you do it? My guess is that if we did that, then we wouldn't have the depleted uranium bullets. And I suspect that a lot of the nuclear stuff that happens throughout the world is actually an excuse to create nuclear weapons, not so much to have the nuclear energy. Because if we weren't so concerned with nuclear weapons, I just wonder why we're not using thorium reactors. So apparently thorium, and again, so I am by far no expert on this. I've only done cursory reading. But apparently thorium also undergoes fission, and we can create nuclear reactors with thorium instead of uranium. And the big, whopping, amazing difference between these two is that we can, with uranium, you actually have to constantly watch it to make sure it doesn't get too hot, because if it gets too hot, it can carry away and we'll have a meltdown. So you're constantly trying to keep it cool so it doesn't get carried away. Thorium, it's the flip side. So you have to constantly keep it running, and if you stop, adding the energy to it, instead of melting down, it'll just shut itself down by itself. So I feel like the massive environmental issue that is nuclear reactors, uranium or mixed oxide nuclear reactors, could potentially be solved, or, especially the ones in Japan, which are sitting on a bunch of fault lines. A lot of these problems could be solved if we simply made them thorium reactors. And, this is something where, we could talk MMT a little bit. Because if we look at a minarchist government, and we say, okay, at the very least, we will allow the government to create infrastructure. Well, if we also recognize that we have to have the government spend money into existence before we even have any money to spend, so it's got to spend its money on something, I feel like this is a big enough project where we could say, look, if we have nuclear reactors, let's make them safe. This is a huge environmental problem. Talk about fault lines. I'm in Washington, where we get earthquakes here too, and there's at least one nuclear reactor here that's on a fault line. It's kind of scary. So either get these things totally modernized and updated, and spend whatever we got to. Federal government can spend whatever it needs to spend in order to make that happen. But what about phasing out the thorium reactors? Oh my God! If it's really going to take that long to get to nuclear fusion, well, let's try these thorium reactors out. And actually, I wanted to move on to the next one, but speaking of Washington, I don't know if you get listeners knew that 2/3 of the plutonium that was needed to drop the Fat Boy bomb on Nagasaki during World War II was actually refined in Washington, in Hanford. And not only was it refined here, the radioactive waste is still sitting in tanks next to and leaking into the Columbia River. What are we, almost 80 years later now? I think we're getting pretty close to 80 years later. Yeah. So let's talk about a little bit about environmentalist problems. How about we get the federal government to write a big fat check to some contractors who can do the cleanup and just get the thing done. This is where the MMT could come in handy, right? Instead of, let's have a Paris Accord and a climate accord this and a climate accord that to stop the CO2, stop the CO2, stop the CO2. Oh my God, the CO2. Well, the drippings from the Fat Man bomb, they dipped the Fat Man bomb in some water, and the juice that was left over is still leaking into the Columbia River. Don't go fishing downstream, I guess. Another one that really gets my goat is actually Roundup. And I know this is a big point of contention. There's this big thing of whether GMOs are bad for you and what exactly that means. And oh my God, farmers have been genetically modifying foods for 5,000 years, and the Roundup doesn't do anything bad to you. And I'm not going to address the GMO thing right now. And although I will say this. Yes, farmers have been genetically modifying food since the beginning of farming. However, if we take that as a definition, genetic modification occurs anytime sexual reproduction occurs because the new life form has been modified from the two parents. However, what farmers have not been doing for the last 5,000 years is taking DNA from bacteria and slamming it into corn DNA so that the corn creates a protein that the bacteria creates in order to bind in the guts of bugs so they cannot digest their food to get them to starve to death when they try to eat the corn. That has not been going on for 5,000 years, and that more specifically is referred to genetic engineering. So when most people say GMO, what they're actually talking about is a GEO. They mean genetically engineered. Not the thing that the farmers have been doing for the last 5,000 years. It's what the genetic engineers have been doing for the last, 50, 60? I don't know how long they've been doing it. But it's definitely a few zeros short of 5,000. However, when it comes to the Roundup, there's this big thing that, Roundup's safe for you because it doesn't harm humans. And this is a lie of omission if I've ever fucking seen one. So this lie is so sneaky. Roundup kills bacteria. Newsflash. Bacteria are vital for the human biome. So we've got a huge amount of bacteria in our gut, and that gut bacteria is completely vital for us to be healthy. It's completely vital for our nutrition. There's a lot of nutrition that we get from our own bodies, that we get for our bodies that isn't directly from the food we eat. A lot of the food that we eat is eaten by the bacteria in our stomachs, and the byproduct of the bacteria, after it eats that food, is the food that we're able to eat. It's like a cow. When a cow eats grass, the cow doesn't directly digest that grass. There's bacteria in its four stomachs that digest that grass, and the cow actually feeds off of the byproduct from those bacteria. We have a similar thing going on. And then, other news flash, mitochondria are bacteria in our bodies. The Roundup damages the gut bacteria, and it damages the mitochondria in our bodies. So, for those of you who forgot your high school biology class, the mitochondria are the powerhouse. They're the nuclear reactor of the cell. And so there's three ways that we make energy in our cells. We do it through fermentation, which creates 2 ATP. ATP is kind of like, it's this chemical that is essentially like a battery. That's the direct energy that our cells use in order to do anything that requires energy. There's another thing called the Krebs cycle, which is, so fermentation is anaerobic, Krebs cycle is aerobic, it requires oxygen, and that also creates 2 ATP. And the mitochondria uses the electron transport chain, which is also anaerobic, again, it requires oxygen. This is why we need oxygen and why it's so important, because we have access to these mitochondria. And I think I'm remembering this correctly. I can't remember if it's 32 or 34, but it's 32 or 34 ATP compared to the 2 and the 2, which are the other two methods of creating ATP. So the mitochondria in our bodies are so vital that I think most of the aging research that's coming out now is pointing to the fact that the way that we age is all dependent on how our mitochondria handle throughout our lives. The better our mitochondria are taken care of, the better we age. So the fact that we are creating these genetically engineered foods, the corn and the soybeans and the bullshit, and we're planting them everywhere and then turning around and spraying Roundup on everything, it is wreaking havoc on not only us, but anything else that has this very delicate bacteria relationship to its own organism. So, yeah, a big environmental problem. I mean, again, it would be a lie of omission for me to directly say, okay, it's the GEO's fault that's causing this environmental problem. No, it's a little more complicated. The GEO, which is put there with the intention of, using the Roundup or specifically the glyphosate, that's the active chemical in the Roundup, to spray this Roundup everywhere because it's, in quotes, safe. And, I'm sure it's, let's take a second to appreciate something like Roundup in terms of technology, where, oh my God, I don't have to weed the garden anymore, or not the garden, the farm anymore, because the stuff's killing the weeds. I mean, that must be great if you're a farmer and you don't realize what the stuff can potentially do to you. But I would put Roundup squarely on the real environmental problems list. Bees. I've heard, I can't prove it, I'm not entirely for sure, but I've heard that the Roundup may also be contributing to the death of bees. It's been, I remember hearing stories about this maybe about 10 years ago, where bees worldwide were just dying off everywhere. There were orchards, particularly in Eastern Washington. Eastern Washington is like this one big fruit basket where, you have to have beehives for your orchards in order for them to pollinate, in order to get your fruit. People were buying beehives and planting these beehives outside, and the bees were flying out of the hive in the morning and straight on the ground and dying. And no one could figure out why all these bees were dying. Now, I'm not turning around and saying, aha, it was the Roundup, because, I don't necessarily know why the bees were dying. But the point is, this is a super duper, ooper environmental problem. Pollinators and bees represent, I don't know, it's 80%, 90%, whatever it is, of the pollinators, obviously are quite vital to everything. We need these pollinators in order for plants to continue to exist, for the most part. And plants, because, of the three main, I know there's five, but of the three macroscopic life kingdoms, you got animals, plants, and fungi. The plants are the only ones that take CO2 out of the air. Oh my God, that horrible, nasty, that evil chemical CO2. They take CO2 out of the air and turn it into organic material. Plants are the link between the inorganic and the organic. So the fact that the bees are dying off is quite an issue, and I feel like whatever we got to do to figure out what's being done to the bees and killing them off and just stop it, I think it's a worthy goal. And I can't prove it, but I think it's worth investigating that the Roundup, or the genetically engineered crops in general, because, hey, these crops were specifically designed to create proteins that kill specific bugs. To say, that might be affecting the bees, I'm not saying it's happening, but I'm saying it's worth investigating. Moving on. This is, I don't know how much this falls under the real environmentalist problem, but I've just seen it firsthand enough times where this is at least a local environmental problem, which is drug addicts, tweakers. I never liked the show. I've seen a couple shows of it, and I found it incredibly boring, which was Breaking Bad. But apparently, obviously, it's been a very popular show, and people like it, and they make memes out of it, and they send me videos when I talk about this. You can get a good idea of what tweakers are like by watching how the meth heads are portrayed in Breaking Bad and how they live. To say they live in squalor, I don't think hits the nail on the head accurately enough. To say that they live in their own shit doesn't hit the nail on the head accurately enough. To say that they live with rats doesn't hit the nail on the head accurately enough. To say that they live with all these things combined maybe gets you a little bit closer to being accurate. But you see, I like to call these places tweaker pads, because I think what happens is, whether there's a landlord that can't kick out some tweakers, or parents die and a tweaker inherits the house or something, that these drug addicts just start to manifest and they collect stuff. They're like automatically hoarders. It's so bizarre. They just hoard everything. And for whatever reason, they love clothes and they love mattresses. Haven't figured that one out. And depending on how nasty they are, they'll live in their own needles. Yeah, sometimes you see them that they're at least organized enough that they'll get like a biohazard box and they'll put their needles in the biohazard box. A lot of them just throw their needles all over the place. So you're going in this place, you're walking over shit, whether that's human shit or rat shit or animal shit. You're walking over rats running around you. Everything's nasty and moldy. The water hasn't been turned on. The power hasn't been turned on. There's probably a hole in the roof. And there's, campers rotting. Everything's totally moldy. On top of all that, there's fucking needles everywhere. You can't tell me that this isn't a public health hazard. At least locally, this is an environmental problem. Imagine this being your neighbor with the rats and the diseases infesting in here. You go you see these places and you're like, okay, how do these people literally not die from the diseases they must be contracting in this place? I'm not even talking about what's like being carried on any needle, right? I'm like, just sometimes I have to wonder if these aren't, government bioweapons labs where they just, give the guys the drugs and be like, all right, we'll check on you next year and see what you guys have made for us. Yeah, so I'll say it. I think drugs are an environmental problem, and I'm not talking about, your weed or whatever, and I'm not saying I'm for the war on drugs, because I think a large part of this has come from the war on drugs. I believe one of the reasons that the drugs have become so potent and so deadly is because, when you make the drugs illegal and you have to smuggle them, the smaller container that you can get the drugs into and then cut it when it reaches its destination, the easier it is to smuggle them, particularly across the border. And then on top of that, These drug ads, they're just given these needles, they're given the methadone, they're given the Suboxone, which are opiates worthy of getting addicted to in their own right. So, yes, it is very much a government problem that these people are allowed to create manifest nastiness. And, of course, so I've been focusing on the tweaker dens. Mostly you find them in more rural areas. And especially in the rural areas, they can make such a bigger mess, because if they're like kind of in the woods, you don't see the mess until you're actually on the property. But move over to the cities where they're just, the tents and the nastiness are popping up everywhere. San Francisco is famous for bum shitting everywhere. They'll ban plastic straws, but they'll give away free plastic needles, which leads me to the next thing, and I think this will be my last one. Plastic. So, plastic is made from oil, obviously, and I don't have a problem with plastic, necessarily. I think the idea of banning plastic bags, I think the idea of banning plastic straws is fucking stupid, particularly if you're going to hand out plastic needles. It's just one more piece of regulatory bullshit. However, with the plastic, I will say this. I think plastic in the oceans is quite the environmentalist problem. You know, when you... what is the name of that trench off Japan? There's the deepest known area of the ocean is off Japan. It's like the Mariana Trench that starts with an M. It's not coming to me right now. And where, I mean, it takes like 4 or 5 hours or something to get a camera down that far just so they can take some pictures and get a vague idea of what's going on down there. That there's even plastic bags and shit down there. And the fact that these plastics are slowly breaking down, that we have what's called microplastics. So, like, every fish, every piece of animal life or plant life or everything down there is just, like, getting full of plastic. You cut open a dead whale's stomach and you just find all this plastic in it. Or you just troll the ocean for 5 minutes with a net and you come out with, like, plastic bottles and straws and all this sort of shit. Plastic in the ocean, I think, is a really big problem. I don't think oceans should be a dump zone. And yes, it's an issue that this plastic lasts for thousands or tens of thousands or whatever, however many thousands and thousands of years it lasts for without degrading. And that's a pretty nasty environmental problem. I mean, what sort of wildlife is it killing in the ocean? And how is that... and how is that, I mean, affecting us personally when we're trying to eat stuff out of the ocean? And I've heard now that sea salt, you don't even want to get sea salt anymore because there's microplastic in the fucking sea salt. There's that much plastic in the ocean. So the first and foremost answer, I think anybody who knows this topic well enough, is biodegradable hemp plastic. I mean, for God fucking sakes, just legalize the hemp and let us have the hemp plastic. That's point one. Point two, when I lived in Austria, the first place I was staying in Austria, I was out in a very rural area. I was living with this family. And I went to throw something away, and it was in a plastic bag. I had a plastic bag full of stuff, and I went to throw the whole thing in the garbage, and the husband of the family is like, hey, stop. Separate the plastic and put it in that bag. I'm like, oh, okay, you guys recycle it, right? And he goes, oh, no, we burn it. And I kind of looked over at him with my eyes wide, and I'm like, you guys do what? And he goes, no, it's okay. It all goes to Vienna, and we have a power plant that's specifically designed to burn plastic for energy. And I was like, what? Those exist? It's called Spittelau. Spittelau, if I remember correctly. Spittelau. You could when you're driving along, I believe it's the U6 subway in Vienna. When you get to the northern side, there's a stop called Spittelau, and you'll see the big tower coming out. It heats the city. The whole country of Austria sends this plastic to Vienna and burns it as fuel. And I've also heard they've got one of these in Singapore. What's stopping us from making these? So theoretically, we have these huge islands of plastic in the ocean. Now, I've heard some people say, oh, it's the size of Texas, it's the size of the United States, or what. I don't know if I believe that, but I do believe that there's a lot of plastic in the ocean. If we were able to turn around and say, okay, let's burn it for energy, couldn't that be a valuable resource where private companies would actually want to go out and say, okay, let's get the plastic out of the ocean so we can bring it back and get paid, and then we just burn it for energy like they already do in Austria and Singapore? And if we do the math and it turns out, okay, on a private basis, that it's not worth the gas and the time to bring a barge out there and bring the plastic back to the coast to burn this stuff, well then, make it an MMT problem. Have the government pay in order to bring this stuff back, because if it's going to get cleaned up, I mean, I'm not saying the government has to do it, but again, if we need the government to introduce the money into the system in order for us to have money anyway, isn't that kind of a laudable cause? Okay, let's get the plastic out of the ocean, and instead of sticking it in the landfill, burn it for energy. Save on some natural gas. Save on some coal. Burn it for energy. Why not? So that's the extent of my real environmentalist problems. If I didn't hit the one that was your favorite, please let me know in the comments. Again, these are the ones more that kind of cross my radar, and I'm not saying that any of these are the worst environmental problems that there possibly exist on Earth. Although I think the depleted uranium is fucking up there. Shooting depleted uranium around a country and just like making it radioactive longer than the Earth is going to exist is pretty ridiculous. Leave us some comments and say, hey, you should have spoke about this. Or if I brought up an idea that I said, and I said this a lot, well, I've heard about this and I'm not sure about that. Well, slap it on and let me know. And with that, this has been Amagi with Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. And unfortunately, we had no Nemo with us today, but next time we will. And if you want to hear about him by himself, you could find him on economicsjunkie.com. We've been graciously hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com, and we will be glad to see you next time. Thanks for listening.